It was a moment that would change two lives forever. Margaret, a woman in her late 50s with tired eyes and a heart heavy with unspoken burdens, stood frozen in the middle of a crowded cafe. Her hands stung from the force of the slap she had just delivered to a stranger's face. The room fell silent, every pair of eyes locked on her and the man she had struck. The stranger, a well-dressed man in his early 60s named Henry, didn't flinch. He simply touched his cheek, his expression unreadable. Margaret's chest heaved with anger, her face flushed with a mix of rage and regret. She had acted on impulse, her emotions boiling over after years of feeling invisible, unheard, and forgotten. What she didn't know, what no one in that cafe knew, was that Henry was a self-made millionaire, a man who had spent decades building an empire but had lost touch with the world outside his wealth. The slap, though shocking, was the spark that would ignite a chain of events neither of them could have predicted. As the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, Henry did something unexpected. Instead of demanding an apology or calling the authorities, he calmly picked up his fallen hat, dusted it off, and said, "You must have had a good reason." Margaret stared at him, her anger giving way to confusion. Who was this man, and why wasn't he furious? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as Henry turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Margaret to face the weight of her actions alone. Little did she know, this was not the end of their story. It was only the beginning. Margaret's life had not always been one of quiet desperation. Once, she had been a vibrant woman, full of dreams and laughter. But life, as it often does, had other plans. Her husband, Thomas, had passed away 10 years ago, leaving her to raise their teenage son, Daniel, on her own. The grief of losing Thomas had been a heavy burden, but it was the relentless grind of daily life that had worn her down over the years. She worked long hours as a cashier at a local grocery store, her feet aching and her spirit dwindling with each passing day. The pay was meager, barely enough to cover rent and groceries, let alone the mounting medical bills for Daniel, who had been diagnosed with a chronic illness. Margaret had sold her wedding ring, her grandmother's antique clock, and even her car to make ends meet. Each sacrifice felt like a piece of her soul chipped away. But it wasn't just the financial strain that weighed on her. It was the loneliness. The feeling that no one saw her, no one cared. Her friends had drifted away, too caught up in their own lives to notice her silent struggles. Daniel, now in his early 20s, was often withdrawn, his own battles with illness and depression creating a wall between them. Margaret loved him fiercely, but she often felt like she was failing him, failing herself. The day of the slap had been particularly hard. She had just received a notice from her landlord, rent was increasing, and she had no idea how she would manage. At the grocery store, a rude customer had berated her for a mistake she hadn't even made. And then, as she sat in the cafe, trying to gather the strength to face another day, she overheard a group of young professionals laughing about how people like her just needed to work harder. It was the last straw. When Henry accidentally bumped into her table, spilling her coffee, something inside Margaret snapped. She didn't even think, she just acted. The slap was a release, a cry for help, a desperate attempt to make someone, anyone, see her. But as she stood there, her hands still tingling, the weight of what she had done began to sink in. She had struck a stranger, a man who had done nothing more than bump into her table. Shame washed over her, mingling with the anger that still simmered beneath the surface. She didn't know it yet, but that moment of raw, unfiltered emotion would set her on a path she could never have imagined. Henry had always been a man of precision. His life was a carefully constructed mosaic of success, wealth, and control. He had built his fortune from the ground up, starting with a small tech company in his 30s and expanding it into a global empire. But somewhere along the way, he had lost something he couldn't quite name. The slap had been a shock, not just to his cheek but to his entire being. He hadn't been struck like that since he was a child, and even then, it had been rare. His parents had been strict but never violent. As he stood in the cafe, the sting still fresh on his face, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: vulnerability. Henry wasn't a man who showed emotion easily. He had spent decades perfecting the art of composure, of maintaining an air of unshakable confidence. But this woman, Margaret, had shattered that facade with a single, unguarded moment. And instead of anger, he felt curiosity. Who was she? What had driven her to such an act? As he left the cafe, Henry's mind raced. He could have called the police, could have made a scene, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the look in Margaret's eyes, a mix of anger and despair that mirrored something deep within himself. He had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from him: his money, his influence, his connections. But Margaret hadn't known who he was. To her, he was just a stranger. That realization struck him harder than the slap itself. Henry decided to find out more about her. It wasn't hard. A few discreet inquiries led him to her workplace and, eventually, her modest apartment building. He watched her from a distance, noting the weariness in her step, the way she carried herself as if the weight of the world was on her shoulders. He learned about her struggles, her late husband, her sick son, her financial woes. And as he pieced together the fragments of her life, he began to see himself in her. Not in her circumstances, but in her isolation. For all his wealth, Henry was lonely. His relationships were transactional, his friendships superficial. He had everything money could buy, but he had no one who truly knew him. Margaret, in her raw honesty, had shown him a mirror. And he didn't like what he saw. Henry made a decision. He would help her, not out of guilt or obligation, but because he saw in her a chance to reconnect with something he had lost: his humanity. But he knew he couldn't reveal his wealth, not yet. If she knew who he was, she might reject his help outright. So he approached her as simply Henry, a man who wanted to make amends for the spilled coffee. What he didn't realize was that this decision would change both of their lives in ways neither of them could have foreseen. Margaret was sweeping the front steps of her apartment building when she saw him again. Henry stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, looking oddly out of place in his tailored coat and polished shoes. Her heart skipped a beat. Was he here to confront her? To demand an apology? She straightened, gripping the broom tightly, her defenses rising. But Henry's expression was calm, almost gentle. "I owe you a coffee," he said, his voice steady. Margaret blinked, caught off guard. "What? I spilled yours the other day. It's only fair I replace it." She studied him, searching for any hint of malice or mockery. But there was none. Just a quiet sincerity that made her uneasy. "I don't need your coffee," she said, turning back to her sweeping. "Maybe not," Henry replied. "But I'd like to talk. If you'll let me." Margaret hesitated. She didn't trust him, didn't trust anyone, really. But there was something about the way he stood there, patient and unassuming, that made her curious. Against her better judgment, she nodded. They walked to a small park nearby, the autumn leaves crunching under their feet. Henry bought 2 cups of coffee from a cart and handed one to Margaret. She took it reluctantly, her guard still up. "Why are you really here?" she asked, cutting straight to the point. Henry took a sip of his coffee, choosing his words carefully. "I wanted to apologize. For bumping into you. And, for whatever it was that made you so angry." Margaret's grip tightened on her cup. "You don't know anything about me." "You're right," Henry admitted. "I don't. But I'd like to." She laughed bitterly. "Why? So you can feel better about yourself? So you can tell your friends about the crazy woman who slapped you?" Henry shook his head. "No. Because I think you're someone worth knowing." Margaret stared at him, her anger faltering. No one had said anything like that to her in years. She didn't know how to respond. They sat on a bench, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. Henry didn't press her to talk, and for that, she was grateful. Instead, he told her a little about himself. Just enough to seem human, not enough to reveal his wealth. He spoke of growing up in a small town, of losing his father young, of working hard to build a life for himself. Margaret found herself listening, despite herself. There was a vulnerability in his words that mirrored her own. When they parted ways, Henry handed her a small piece of paper with his phone number. "If you ever need anything," he said, "call me." Margaret took it, though she had no intention of using it. But as she walked home, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Henry, meanwhile, felt a strange sense of hope. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something meaningful. Neither of them knew it yet, but their lives were about to become intertwined in ways they could never have imagined. Weeks passed, and Margaret found herself thinking about Henry more often than she cared to admit. She hadn't called him, but his words lingered in her mind. "If you ever need anything, call me." She had tucked his number into the drawer of her nightstand, a small, unspoken lifeline she wasn't sure she'd ever use. Then, one evening, everything changed. Daniel's condition worsened. His chronic illness flared up, and he was rushed to the hospital. Margaret sat by his bedside, her heart breaking as she watched him struggle to breathe. The doctor said he needed a specialized treatment, one that wasn't covered by insurance. The cost was astronomical, far beyond anything Margaret could afford. Desperate, she dug through her nightstand drawer, her fingers trembling as she pulled out the piece of paper with Henry's number. She hesitated, her pride warring with her fear. But in the end, her love for Daniel won. She dialed the number. Henry answered on the second ring. "It's Margaret," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I need your help." He didn't ask questions. He simply said, "Tell me where you are." When Henry arrived at the hospital, Margaret was waiting in the lobby. She looked exhausted, her face pale and drawn. Henry's heart ached for her. "What's wrong?" he asked gently. Margaret explained the situation, her voice breaking as she spoke. Henry listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he nodded. "Let me take care of it," he said. Margaret stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" Henry hesitated. He had planned to keep his wealth a secret, to help her in small, unnoticed ways. But this was different. This was life and death. "I have the means to cover the treatment," he said carefully. "Let me help." Margaret's eyes widened. "Who are you?" Henry sighed. "Someone who wants to make a difference." But Margaret wasn't satisfied. She pressed him, her suspicion growing. Finally, Henry relented. "I'm wealthy," he admitted. "I didn't tell you before because I didn't want you to treat me differently. But now, with Daniel." Margaret's face flushed with anger. "You lied to me." "I didn't lie," Henry said quickly. "I just didn't tell you everything. You let me think you were just some ordinary guy," Margaret snapped. "Was this some kind of game to you? See how the other half lives?" Henry shook his head. "No. That's not it at all. I wanted to help. Without all the complications." Margaret crossed her arms, her eyes blazing. "Well, congratulations. You've complicated everything." Henry took a deep breath. "Margaret, I know you're angry. And you have every right to be. But right now, Daniel needs this treatment. Let me help him. Please." Margaret looked away, her jaw clenched. She wanted to refuse, to tell him to leave and never come back. But she couldn't. Not when Daniel's life was on the line. "Fine," she said finally, her voice tight. "But this doesn't mean I forgive you." Henry nodded. "I understand. As he arranged for the treatment, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. She had let her guard down, allowed herself to trust him, and now she felt foolish. But as she watched Daniel's condition improve over the following days, her anger began to waver. Henry visited often, bringing books and games for Daniel, who quickly warmed to him. He never asked for gratitude, never tried to justify his actions. He simply showed up, quietly and consistently. Margaret didn't know what to make of him. But deep down, she couldn't deny that he had saved her son's life. And that was something she couldn't ignore. The days turned into weeks, and Daniel's health continued to improve. The specialized treatment had worked wonders, and for the first time in years, Margaret allowed herself to hope. But her relationship with Henry remained strained. She was grateful for what he had done, but the revelation of his wealth had left a bitter taste in her mouth. One evening, as she sat by Daniel's bedside, Henry walked into the hospital room carrying a small potted plant. "For the room," he said, placing it on the windowsill. "Something green to brighten things up." Margaret nodded stiffly. "Thank you." Henry hesitated, then sat down in the chair across from her. "Margaret, we need to talk." She looked up, her expression guarded. "About what?" "About us," he said. "About what happened." Margaret sighed. "What's there to talk about? You lied to me. You let me think you were someone you're not." "I didn't lie," Henry said firmly. "I just didn't tell you everything. And I did that because I wanted to help you without you feeling indebted to me. I wanted to be, just Henry." Margaret shook her head. "But you're not, just Henry. You're a millionaire. You live in a world I can't even imagine. And yet, here I am," Henry said quietly. "Sitting in a hospital room, talking to you." Margaret looked away, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know how to feel about you. I'm grateful for what you've done for Daniel, but I can't shake the feeling that you've been playing some kind of game." Henry leaned forward, his voice earnest. "It was never a game, Margaret. I meant every word I said to you. I care about you. And I care about Daniel." Margaret wiped her eyes, her emotions a tangled mess. "Why? Why do you care so much?" Henry hesitated, then said, "Because you showed me something I'd forgotten. You showed me what it means to be real. To feel. To care. For years, I've been surrounded by people who only wanted something from me. But you didn't even know who I was. And yet, you let me into your life. That meant something to me." Margaret stared at him, her heart aching. She wanted to believe him, but the fear of being hurt again held her back. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said finally. Henry nodded. "I understand. And I don't expect you to trust me right away. But I'm asking for a chance to prove myself. To show you that I'm not the person you think I am." Margaret was silent for a long time. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Okay. One chance." Henry smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Thank you." As the days passed, Henry began to prove himself in small but meaningful ways. He spent hours with Daniel, reading to him, playing games, and listening to his stories. He helped Margaret with errands, never overstepping but always offering support. And slowly, Margaret began to see a different side of him, a side that was kind, humble, and deeply human. One afternoon, as they sat together in the hospital cafeteria, Margaret turned to him. "Why did you really come back that day? After I slapped you?" Henry thought for a moment, then said, "Because I saw something in you that I hadn't seen in a long time. Honesty. Courage. And I realized that I needed that in my life." Margaret smiled faintly. "You're not what I expected, Henry." "Neither are you," he replied. For the first time in a long time, Margaret felt a flicker of hope, not just for Daniel, but for herself. As Daniel's health continued to stabilize, Margaret found herself spending more time with Henry. What had started as a tentative truce slowly blossomed into a genuine friendship. They talked about everything, their pasts, their dreams, their regrets. Margaret learned about Henry's childhood, his struggles to build his business, and the loneliness that had crept into his life despite his success. Henry, in turn, listened as Margaret shared her fears, her grief, and her hopes for Daniel's future. One evening, as they walked through the hospital gardens, Margaret turned to Henry. "I think I owe you an apology," she said. Henry raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For judging you," she admitted. "I was so angry when I found out about your wealth. I thought you were just another rich guy playing savior. But you're not. You're different." Henry smiled. "Thank you. That means a lot." Margaret hesitated, then said, "I'm still not sure I understand why you've done all this. Why you've stuck around." Henry stopped walking and turned to face her. "Because you've changed me, Margaret. That day in the cafe, when you slapped me, it was like a wake-up call. I realized how disconnected I'd become from the world. From people. You reminded me what it means to feel something real." Margaret looked at him, her eyes softening. "I think you've changed me too. I was so angry at the world, so closed off. But you've shown me that not everyone is out to hurt me. That there are still good people out there." Henry reached out and gently took her hand. "Margaret, I know I can't erase the pain you've been through. But I want to be someone you can count on. Someone who's there for you, no matter what." Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. For so long, she had carried her burdens alone. But now, for the first time, she felt like she didn't have to. "Thank you," she whispered. Henry squeezed her hand. "You don't have to thank me. Just, let me be here." As they stood there, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the garden, Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She had spent so much of her life holding on to anger, to pain, to the belief that she was alone. But now, she realized, she didn't have to. Forgiveness, she thought, wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about letting go of the weight it carried. And as she looked at Henry, she knew she was ready to let go. With Daniel's health steadily improving, Margaret felt a renewed sense of hope. The weight that had pressed on her chest for so long began to lift, replaced by a cautious optimism. Henry continued to be a constant presence in their lives, but now it felt different, less like an obligation and more like a partnership. One Saturday morning, Henry surprised Margaret with a picnic in the park. He had packed a basket with sandwiches, fruit, and a thermos of tea, and they sat together under the shade of a large oak tree. "This is nice," Margaret said, leaning back against the tree. "I can't remember the last time I did something like this." Henry smiled. "Me neither. I think I've spent too much time in boardrooms and not enough time in parks." Margaret laughed, a sound that felt foreign but wonderful. "Well, we'll have to change that." As they ate, they talked about the future. Margaret shared her dreams of going back to school, of finding a job that didn't leave her exhausted and drained. Henry listened intently, offering encouragement and ideas. "You know," he said, "I could help you with that. Not with money, but with connections. I know people who could give you a chance." Margaret hesitated. "I don't want to rely on you for everything, Henry." "I know," he said gently. "And you don't have to. But sometimes, it's okay to accept help. Especially when it's offered freely." Margaret nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you. For everything." Henry reached over and took her hand. "You don't have to thank me. Seeing you and Daniel happy, that's all the thanks I need." As the weeks turned into months, Margaret and Henry grew closer. They spent weekends exploring the city, visiting museums, and taking long walks. Daniel, now back on his feet, joined them whenever he could, his laughter filling the air. One evening, as they sat on Margaret's porch watching the sunset, Henry turned to her. "Margaret, there's something I've been wanting to ask you." She looked at him, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" Henry took a deep breath. "I know we've been through a lot together. And I know I'm not perfect. But I can't imagine my life without you and Daniel in it. So, would you let me be a part of your family? Officially?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. For so long, she had been afraid to hope, to dream of a future that included love and happiness. But now, as she looked at Henry, she realized that she didn't have to be afraid anymore. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, I would." Henry smiled, his eyes shining with emotion. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that felt like a promise. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She had found love, not in spite of her struggles, but because of them. And she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't face them alone. The years that followed were filled with moments Margaret once thought she'd never experience again: joy, laughter, and a sense of belonging. Henry became a steadfast presence in her life and in Daniel's, not as a savior or a benefactor, but as a partner and a friend. Together, they built a life that was rich in ways that had nothing to do with money. Margaret went back to school, earning a degree in social work. She found a job at a community center, where she helped families who were struggling, just as she once had. Henry supported her every step of the way, not with his wealth, but with his unwavering belief in her. Daniel, now healthy and thriving, pursued his passion for art. Henry encouraged him, even turning a spare room in their home into a studio. The bond between them grew stronger, and Margaret often found herself marveling at the way life had brought them all together. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Daniel raised his glass. "To family," he said, his voice warm with gratitude. Margaret and Henry clinked their glasses with his, their eyes meeting in a silent understanding. They had come so far, not just as individuals, but as a family. As the years passed, Margaret often thought back to that day in the cafe, to the moment she had slapped a stranger in anger. It had been a turning point, not just for her, but for Henry as well. That single act of raw emotion had set them on a path neither of them could have predicted. Margaret realized that life was full of such moments, moments that seemed insignificant at the time but held the power to change everything. It wasn't about the mistakes you made or the pain you carried. It was about what you did next. She had learned to forgive, not just Henry, but herself. She had learned that it was okay to lean on others, to accept help, and to believe in the possibility of a better tomorrow. And most of all, she had learned that love, in all its forms, was the greatest gift of all. As she sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun set, Henry joined her. He took her hand, his touch familiar and comforting. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Margaret smiled. "Just how lucky we are." Henry nodded. "We are. But it's not luck, Margaret. It's choice. We chose to forgive. We chose to trust. And we chose to love." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his presence. She knew he was right. Life wasn't about the cards you were dealt, it was about how you played them. And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. She had found her way through the darkness, and in doing so, she had discovered a light that would guide her for the rest of her days. The end.